Chapter 1. A blinding white light stabbed into his eyes. Ethan felt as if his skull had been split open and stitched back together, the pain leaving him dazed. He tried wiggling his fingers and realized something was gripping his hand tightly. When he opened his eyes, he saw the profile of a woman. Her skin so pale it was almost translucent, droplets of water clinging to her eyelashes, her lips pressed into a thin line. She was crying. Ethan stared at her for a few seconds. His mind was a void. He couldn't remember anything. Who he was, why he was lying here, who this woman was, all of it seemed to have been erased with an eraser. The woman noticed the movement and jerked her head up. Her eyelids were terrifyingly red, dark bluish shadows under her eyes, as if she hadn't slept for days. "You're awake?" Her voice was terribly hoarse. Her hand clenched tighter, her nails nearly digging into Ethan's palm. Ethan opened his mouth. His throat was so dry he couldn't make a sound. He looked at this woman. Beautiful. So beautiful he couldn't look away, but there was something indescribable in her gaze, like a drowning person clutching at a last straw. He spoke on instinct, his voice raspy. "Wife." The air froze in that instant. The woman went rigid, clenching his hand so hard it hurt, her pupils widening, lips parting slightly, as if she'd heard something impossible. Ethan himself was startled by those two words. He didn't recognize the woman, didn't know why he had called her wife, but when the words slipped from his mouth, they sounded as if he'd said them 1,000 times before. He tried to explain, but found he had nothing to say. The woman stared at him, tears welling up more and more in her eyes, until she could no longer bear the weight, and they rolled down her cheeks. "What did you call me?" Her voice trembled. Ethan opened his mouth, then only said, "I don't know. I don't remember anything. But I saw you staying here, holding my hand, crying. I feel like I should know you." The woman said nothing. She just looked at him, tears flowing steadily, her lips pressed so tight they had gone pale. 8 years ago, she learned his name for the first time. It was the first day of 10th grade. The class assignments were posted on the bulletin board, people pressing in close. She stood outside the crowd, on her toes to see the densely filled paper, and found that name in the last line, Ethan. She read it once, and thought the name sounded beautiful. Later she learned where he sat, that he liked to rest his head on the desk during breaks, that he always walked with his head down and didn't talk much. She would deliberately slow her pace when passing his desk, pretend to look elsewhere when he glanced up, and hold her breath as they brushed past each other in the hallway. He had never looked at her. At the senior high sports meet, she bought a bottle of water and stood by the track for half an hour before mustering the courage to walk over and hand it to him. He took it, said thanks, and turned to leave. She brought the empty bottle home and put it in the back of a drawer. In college, he was with Sophia. That day she saw them walking hand in hand in the cafeteria. The tray in her hand nearly slipped to the floor. She hid behind the classroom building and cried for 2 hours, then wiped her tears and pretended nothing had happened. After graduation, he went to Beijing. She went to Beijing too. She told her mother there were more opportunities there. In truth, only she knew the reason. 8 years. She waited 8 years, guarded 8 years, hid 8 years. He had never once looked back at her. Not until the car accident 3 days ago. She shoved him away and was thrown clear, a long gash torn along her arm by shattered glass. Blood dripped from her elbow onto the ground, but she only scrambled to her feet to check on him. He lay on the ground, blood from his forehead staining half his face red. She knelt beside him, her hand trembling so much she couldn't press down the wound on his head. Tears mixed with blood smeared her face. "Don't die. Please don't die." Now he's awake. He called her his wife. 8 years. This is the first time he's called her wife. Vivian clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. She knew he had lost his memory. She knew how despicable it was to take advantage of someone in such a state. She knew that if one day his memory returned, he would hate her. But her mind was filled with images from those 8 years. The casual expression he wore when handing her a sticky note, the sight of him and Sophia walking away hand in hand, the way he lay with his eyes closed in a pool of blood. She had waited for far too long. Vivian took a deep breath, forced the tears in her eyes back, and then pulled on a smile. "You're finally awake, husband." Her voice still trembled, but she forced it to sound natural. Ethan was stunned for a moment. Then he smiled too. His smile was gentle, tinged with remorse, sorry for making you worry. As he spoke, he reached back and took Vivian's hand, his fingers gently squeezing the back of her hand. Vivian's fingers went rigid in an instant. It was the first time he had ever taken her hand on his own. Ethan said, "I don't remember anything. Can you tell me who I am? How did we meet?" Vivian lowered her lashes, her eyelashes shielding the emotions in her eyes. Her voice was steady, steady as if rehearsed countless times. "Your name is Ethan. You're 26 years old. We have been married for 2 years." Her hand was trembling, but her voice was not. "We just never registered the marriage." Ethan looked at her, his gaze full of trust. "Okay," he said. "I believe you." In the afternoon, the Civil Affairs Bureau staff Vivian had arranged arrived at the hospital. Ethan signed his name on the hospital bed. His hand was still a little unsteady, but each stroke was made with care. When a marriage certificate was handed to him, he looked at the photo on it and smiled softly. "Wife," he called her, his voice as tender as someone calling a person he'd known for a long time. "Let's go home." Vivian stood by the hospital bed, looking at the marriage certificate in his hand, at the smile on his face, at the trusting, defenseless look in his eyes. She turned away, the smile vanishing, a tear slipping down the corner of her eye. She had deceived him. She knew she was deceiving him, but she didn't want to let go. Chapter 2. The Gu family's mansion was larger than Ethan had imagined. The car drove through the iron gate, followed the neatly trimmed garden path for 3 minutes before coming to a stop. The butler Arthur stood at the doorway, dressed in a crisp black suit, his hair combed impeccably. "Sir, welcome home." His tone was respectful, but for a split second his expression became complicated, quickly hidden by his lowered gaze. Ethan had just stepped out of the car when Vivian linked her arm through his. Her movement was natural, as if she had done it countless times, yet Ethan felt her fingers tighten slightly. "Tired?" "Not really." Ethan looked around. The 3-story white building resembled some kind of European manor. The garden was planted with flowers whose names he couldn't recall, and the fountain shimmered in the sunlight. "This is our home." Vivian nodded. You used to love sitting in the garden's wicker chair to read." Ethan tried hard to recall something, but his mind remained a blank. He could only nod and follow her through the front door. The living room rose 2 stories high, a crystal chandelier hanging from the ceiling, casting delicate shadows across the floor. Vivian held his hand as they walked to the dining room. Breakfast had already been laid out on the table. Ethan glanced over and froze. The soft-boiled egg, the bread cut into small pieces, a cup of black coffee without sugar or milk beside it. He didn't know why he knew this was what he liked, but the moment he saw the breakfast plate, he felt an inexplicable familiarity. "I remember everything you like." Vivian sat down across from him, her voice even, but for an instant her eyes flickered. Ethan picked up the fork and took a bite of the fried egg. It tasted good, exactly the texture he liked. He said, "Thank you." Vivian lowered her eyes and said nothing. After breakfast, Vivian showed him around the entire house. The study, the home theater, the gym, the swimming pool. Every room was neat and tidy, as if someone had been carefully maintaining them. Ethan asked, "Are you usually busy with work?" Vivian said, "Not really. I handle the company's matters quickly." She spoke easily, but Ethan noticed Arthur standing at the end of the corridor, an indescribable meaning in his eyes. In the afternoon, Ethan wanted to go out for a walk. He had only just reached the garden gate when 2 men in black suits stopped him. "Sir, you cannot go out alone." "Why?" "Madam's orders." Ethan frowned. He turned and walked back, encountering Vivian at the living room doorway. She had just returned from outside, still wearing that dark gray coat, a file in her hand. She asked, "What's the matter?" "I want to go out for a walk," he said. "They say I can't." Vivian's brows knitted slightly as she hurried to his side and looped his arm with hers. She said, her voice softened, "It's not safe outside." I'll go with you, okay? Ethan looked at her. Her gaze was serious, bearing a certain stubbornness. He suddenly remembered the maid from that morning. She had looked at Ethan a few times, and Vivian had immediately told her to pack up and leave. Did you fire that maid because she looked at me? Vivian lowered her lashes, her voice very soft. I don't like others looking at you. Her tone was matter-of-fact, as if it needed no explanation. Ethan did not speak. That evening, when Vivian returned from the office, her entire aura had changed. The aloof, reserved CEO from the daytime was gone, replaced by a clingy little girl. She took off her coat, changed into loungewear, curled up on the sofa, and buried her face in the hollow of Ethan's neck. I missed you so much today. Her voice was muffled, carrying a hint of coquettishness. Ethan froze for a moment, then reached out and patted her head. Her hair was very soft, with a faint scent of shampoo. Are you tired from work during the day? I'm fine. I just missed you. She said it as if it were the most natural thing in the world, as if this were the most ordinary fact on earth. Ethan looked down at her and noticed her eyelashes trembling slightly. He suddenly became aware of her left forearm, the sleeve pushed up, revealing a long scar running from elbow to wrist. What happened? His finger lightly touched the scar. Vivian's body stiffened instantly. An old wound. It doesn't hurt anymore. She tried to pull her hand back, but Ethan didn't let go. His fingertip gently traced the scar as he frowned. How did it happen? Vivian was silent for a few seconds, then finally said, It happened in the car accident. It was grazed. Ethan's fingers stopped. He stared at the scar, something inside him stirring. He didn't remember the accident, didn't remember how she was hurt, but he could imagine how painful it must have been. He said, his voice very soft, I'm sorry. Vivian lifted her head to look at him, a certain emotion surging in her eyes. Why apologize? For hurting you. She stared at him for a few seconds, then suddenly buried her face in his chest and wrapped her arms around his waist. Her voice was muffled. It's all right, as long as you're okay. Late at night, Ethan was woken by some feeling. He half opened his eyes and saw Vivian sitting on the edge of the bed, her eyes red as she stared at him. Her lips were moving, as if saying something, but the sound was so faint he couldn't make it out. Vivian, he called her groggily. She froze for a moment, then quickly lay back down beside him and buried her face in his chest. It's nothing, I had a nightmare. Her voice was still trembling, but it calmed down quickly. Ethan wanted to ask what she had dreamed, but sleep weighed on him, and he sank back into a deep slumber. The next morning, Ethan looked for clothes in the wardrobe. He opened the bottom drawer, intending to find a lighter jacket, but found it empty. He rummaged through the other drawers. There were no old clothes of his, no photos of the two of them, nothing that belonged to the male owner. The whole room looked as if Vivian had lived alone in it for a long time. Ethan's hand froze in midair. He stared at the empty drawer, and the vague question in his mind grew increasingly clear. Chapter 3. Ethan didn't tell Vivian. He only closed the drawer, nonchalantly chose a coat to put on, and then went downstairs to have breakfast. Vivian was already sitting at the dining table, looking at documents on her tablet. She wore a beige knit sweater, her hair loosely pinned at the back of her head, and looked much softer than usual. Morning. She looked up and smiled. Morning. Ethan sat down across from her and took a sip of his coffee. He spoke, his voice flat. Vivian, how do we know each other? Vivian's fingers froze. She set the tablet down and looked at him, her eyes flickering for a moment. Why are you asking this all of a sudden? Ethan said, I just wanted to try to remember some things. The doctor said that recalling the past more often might help. Vivian lowered her eyes and was silent for a few seconds. Her voice was soft. We met at a friend's gathering. Then we gradually got close, and we started dating. A friend's gathering? What friends? Vivian's eyelashes fluttered. Your old friends, the ones you don't talk about much. Ethan noticed her tone was somewhat vague. She said a friend's gathering, but didn't say whose friend, whose gathering, or what happened. All the details seemed deliberately blurred. Ethan pressed on. When we were dating, did anything special happen? Like our first date or a proposal? Vivian's fingers clenched the edge of the tablet. Her voice was very soft. A proposal. We didn't like those ceremonies, so we naturally just fell together. There was no proposal. Ethan filed that detail away in his mind. He said, "We've been married 2 years. We should have a lot of photos together, right? Or maybe we went on trips or something." Vivian's body visibly stiffened. She said, You don't really like taking pictures. We're both busy with work, so we don't have much time to go out." Ethan didn't ask any more questions. He simply nodded, continued eating breakfast, as if he believed every word she said. But in his heart, that doubt grew clearer and clearer. In the afternoon, Ethan went online in the study. He opened a browser and typed in his own name. There weren't many search results. A few scattered pieces of information pointed to him having once been an ordinary employee at a tech company, his position a product manager, his work unremarkable. There was no trace of married or son-in-law of the Goo Group. He flipped through his phone photo album again. Inside were only some landscape shots, food photos, and a few selfies. No pictures with Vivian, no wedding photos, no record of them living a life together. His past seemed to have nothing to do with Vivian. Ethan turned off his phone, leaned back in a chair, and stared blankly at the ceiling. "Sir," Arthur's voice came from the doorway. Ethan turned his head and saw the old butler standing there, holding a cup of tea. "Would you like something to drink?" "Thank you." Arthur stepped in and set the teacup on the table. His movements were steady, but Ethan noticed a fleeting complexity in his expression. Ethan spoke. "Arthur, how long have you worked here?" Arthur said, 20 years, sir. I've been here since the madam was child." "Then, you must know a lot about Vivian and me, right?" Arthur's hand stopped. He lowered his gaze and was silent for a few seconds. "Sir, some things aren't for me to say." Ethan looked at him. "I just want to know, where did I live before? What were my habits? What did I like or dislike?" Arthur hesitated. "Sir, you used to live outside." "Outside?" Arthur said, "You have your own apartment. In the east of the city, close to the company." Ethan frowned. "Am I not living here?" "Sir." Ethan cut him off. "Vivian said we've been married for 2 years." "Married for 2 years? How could I be living in my own apartment?" Arthur didn't say anything. His silence was the answer. Just then, Vivian's voice came from downstairs. "Arthur, where are you?" Arthur's body visibly stiffened. He looked at Ethan, something indescribable in his eyes, then strode quickly toward the door. "I'm in the study, ma'am." Ethan followed him out of the study and ran into Vivian in the corridor. She had just come in from outside, still wearing that dark gray coat, a file in her hand. She looked at Arthur, then at Ethan. "What's wrong? What are you talking about?" Arthur said, his voice respectful but steady. "The gentleman was asking me about the past." Vivian's expression shifted slightly. "About what?" Ethan spoke, his tone calm. "It's nothing. I just want to learn something about my past." Vivian looked at him, a certain wariness in her eyes. She said, "Arthur, the gentleman has just been discharged. Don't let him get too tired." "Yes, madam." Arthur bowed slightly and turned to leave. Ethan watched his retreating back and noticed that the old butler, at the moment he turned, glanced at Vivian. That look wasn't directed at the lady of the house, but at a child who needed pity. At dinner, Vivian received a phone call. She stood up. "Sorry, there's something urgent at the office. I'll go handle it in the study." Ethan nodded. He watched her walk toward the door at the end of the corridor. She had said it was her private study, where she kept some work files, and it wasn't appropriate for him to look inside. Ethan put down his chopsticks, waited a few seconds, then stood and followed. Vivian stood at the doorway, entering the code. The door opened. She walked in, and it closed behind her. Ethan stopped a few steps away, staring at the shut door. He tried pushing it. It wouldn't budge. The door was locked. He stood in the doorway, staring at that door for a long time. After dinner, he found Vivian and asked that question. "Vivian, what's in that study?" Vivian's hand trembled slightly. She said, "It's some work documents. They involve company secrets. It's not appropriate for you to see." Ethan looked into her eyes. There was fear in her eyes. She was afraid he would discover something. Ethan said, "Fine, I won't look." He turned and walked away. As he reached the stairwell, He glanced back once. Vivian remained standing where she was, staring at his retreating figure, some emotion stirring in the depths of her eyes. Late at night, Ethan lay in bed with his eyes closed, listening to the sound around him. Vivian thought he was asleep. She rose quietly and tiptoed toward the door. Ethan opened his eyes and watched her figure vanish at the end of the corridor. That direction led to her private study. He stared at the ceiling, the vague question in his mind growing clearer and finally hardening into a single sentence. What exactly is this woman who loves him deeply hiding? Chapter 4. Early the next morning, Vivian told Ethan she had to go on a business trip for the day. There's a project at the company that needs handling. I won't be back until tonight. She stood in the doorway, wearing that dark gray coat and holding a briefcase. You rest at home. If anything comes up, contact Arthur. Ethan nodded. Vivian looked at him, her eyes flashing a moment of complexity, as if she wanted to say something, but in the end she only turned and left. Before she left, she glanced back at the door at the end of the corridor. That direction led to her private study. Ethan stood by the window, watching Vivian's car drive out through the iron gate and vanish at the far end of the garden. He turned and walked toward the dining room. Arthur stood by the dining table, arranging the cutlery. Ethan asked, "Arthur, has Vivian gone?" Arthur said, "Yes, sir. Madam said she'll be back tonight." Ethan was silent for a few seconds. He asked, "The study, where are the keys?" Arthur's hand froze. He looked up at Ethan, a look in his eyes that carried some indescribable meaning. "Sir, there are some things. Maybe you should have seen them a long time ago." He didn't ask Ethan why he was looking for the keys, nor did he stop him. He simply went to the cabinet in the corner, took out a small tin box, and took a key from it. Arthur said, "Madam hid a spare key here." She said, "In case one day you wanted to know the truth." He placed the key on the table. Ethan looked at the key, something churning inside him. "She knew I would come?" Arthur lowered his eyelids. He said, "She has waited for you a long time, sir. She wants more than anyone for you to know the truth, but she didn't dare to tell you herself." Ethan picked up the keys. He walked toward the door at the end of the corridor. The key slid into the lock, turned, and the door opened. Ethan froze the moment he pushed the door open. The whole room looked like a small museum. Various size frames hung on the wall, but they didn't hold photographs. Instead, they held carefully preserved slips of paper, the high school class roster laminated into a frame, a handwritten little tag beside it. 2018, sophomore year, the first time I learned his name. A sticky note he wrote at the sports meet tucked into a clear frame. The tag reading, 2019, Sports Day. When he handed me water, he said, "Thank you." The graduation ceremony invitation, a well-thumbed copy of the little prints, several yellowing sticky notes. Beside each item was a handwritten little tag by Vivian, noting the date and a brief description. Ethan's hands began to tremble. He walked to the desk and found a thick diary lying on it. He turned to the first page. September 1st, 2018. The class assignments came out today. He's not in my class, but I learned his name. Ethan. Such a nice name. He kept turning the pages. May 10th, 2019. At the sports meet, I handed him some water. He took it and said thank you, and I was happy all day. March 15th, 2020. He got together with Sophia. I stood behind a classroom building and cried for 2 hours, then wiped my tears and pretended nothing had happened. June 20th, 2021. Graduation. I decided to go to Beijing because he went to Beijing. When Mom asked why, I said there were more opportunities there. Only I knew the real reason. 2022 to 2025. The diary becomes fragmented, but every page is filled with things about him. His job, where he lived, the times his name appeared in the news. The last page is dated 3 days ago. He woke up. He called me his wife. 8 years. This was the first time he'd called me his wife. I knew I was taking advantage of him, but this time I didn't want to miss it again. Ethan closed the diary. He sat on the study floor, looking at the wall full of collections about himself, his whole being seeming emptied out. 8 years. One person for a full 8 years, like someone who never cared about her. And he had never once looked back at her. "Sir, Arthur's voice came from the doorway. Ethan looked up and saw the old butler standing there, his eyes rimmed in red. "She waited for you a long time," Arthur said softly. "Why didn't you tell me?" Ethan's voice was hoarse. Arthur said, "This isn't my secret. It's hers. She wanted to tell you herself, but she was afraid you'd leave once you knew the truth." Ethan lowered his head and looked at the line in the diary. "I don't want to keep missing out. She lied to him into marriage. But she waited for him for 8 years. Just then, the doorbell rang. Ethan stood up and walked to the door. He opened it and found a woman he didn't recognize standing outside. She looked at him, her eyes full of surprise and pity. Her voice trembled. "Ethan, I finally found you. I'm Sophia. Don't you remember me? I'm the one you loved." Ethan was stunned. Sophia, the name mentioned in that diary. He asked, "How are you here?" Sophia's eyes reddened. "I've been looking for you for a long time. After your car accident, I couldn't get in touch with you. Are you okay?" She glanced into the room, and her expression changed slightly. She frowned. "This is the Gu family's house? How are you here?" Ethan didn't answer. Sophia saw his confusion and took a deep breath. Her voice grew serious. "Ethan, there are things you need to know. You and Vivian are not husband and wife. She took advantage of your amnesia and tricked you into signing the marriage certificate." Ethan's body went rigid. Sophia spoke slowly, word by word. "You don't have wedding photos. No mutual friends know you're married, and you never liked her before. You found her brooding and dangerous. She had a secret crush on you for 8 years, but you never responded to her." Her words were like a knife, piercing precisely into the doubts in Ethan's heart. No wedding photos, no pictures together, no traces of shared life. His past had no overlap with Vivian at all. Ethan asked, "How do you know these things?" Sophia's tears fell. "Because I was with you for 3 years. I am the one you loved deeply." Ethan looked at her, his mind in utter confusion. Vivian had deceived him. But in her diary, every single word was true. She waited for him for 8 years. He never once looked back at her. Chapter 5. Sophia's words were like a knife, cutting through the defenses of Ethan's heart stroke by stroke. She stood in the center of the living room, looking around. "Think about it. Is there anything in this house that belongs to you? Any photos of the two of you? Any traces of a life you shared?" Ethan said nothing. He remembered the empty wardrobe, the room with no sign of a male owner, the locked study. Sophia went on, "You don't have a wedding photo. No mutual friends know you two are married. There are no pictures of her on your phone. And on her phone, are you sure there are any of you?" Ethan thought of Vivian's phone. She never let him look at it, saying it was confidential work material. Sophia's voice carried a kind of urgency. "You never liked her before. You thought she was gloomy, dangerous, unapproachable. You were even afraid of her." Afraid. Ethan looked at Sophia and caught hold of that word. Afraid? Sophia lowered her voice. "The way she looks at you. You said that look makes you feel suffocated, as if something is staring at you and you can't escape." Ethan didn't speak. He remembered Vivian sitting on the edge of the bed late at night, her eyes red as she stared at him. Sophia said, "She has been secretly in love with you for 8 years. Since high school. But you never responded to her. You didn't even know she existed." She stepped in front of Ethan and grabbed his arm. "Ethan, she took advantage of your amnesia to trick you into marrying her. This isn't love. This is kidnapping." Ethan looked at her, his mind a jumble. What Sophia said was true. Every sentence struck precisely at the doubts he had uncovered. No photos together. No shared life. No traces of a past. He and Vivian didn't at all resemble a couple who had been married for 2 years. Just then, footsteps came from the doorway. Ethan looked up and saw Vivian standing in the doorway. She was wearing that dark gray coat, holding a briefcase, her face as pale as paper. She saw Sophia. Then she saw Ethan. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Sophia released Ethan's arm and turned to Vivian. Sophia's voice was sharp. "You lied to him. You took advantage of his amnesia and tricked him into signing the marriage certificate. You told him you'd been married for 2 years, but you two aren't husband and wife at all. Vivian didn't speak. She just stood in the doorway, looking at Ethan. There was no anger in her eyes, no hysteria, only a profound exhaustion. Ethan's voice was very soft. Is what she said true? Vivian's lips trembled for a long time. Finally, she spoke a single word. Yes. The air froze in that instant. Ethan looked at her, and something inside him was slowly shattering. You lied to me. Yes. We're not married. Yes. You took advantage of my amnesia and tricked me into signing the marriage certificate. Vivian didn't answer. She just looked at him, her eyes growing redder and redder, but no tears fell. Ethan asked why. Vivian lowered her eyelids. Because I've waited too long. 8 years. I've waited 8 years. I know this is taking advantage of someone at their weakest. I know this is deception, but I don't want to miss out again. She looked up at him and said, I'm sorry. Ethan said nothing. Sophia stepped up to him and hooked her arm through his. Ethan, let's go. She lied to you. You don't owe her anything. She stood in the doorway, pale-faced, her lips drained of color, but there was no pleading in her eyes, no attempt to stop him. She simply watched him, as if waiting for a verdict. Vivian said, I'll help you pack your things. If you want to leave, I won't stop you. She turned and walked toward the stairs. Ethan watched her retreating figure, something churning inside him. She had deceived him, but every word in her diary was true. She had waited for him for 8 years. He had never once looked back at her. Vivian returned to the room and opened the wardrobe. Ethan didn't have many clothes, only the ones she'd bought for him in the past few days. She packed everything neatly into the suitcase, her hand shaking the whole time. Arthur stood in the doorway, his eyes rimmed with red. Madam! Vivian didn't turn around. Uncle Arthur, give me a ticket abroad. Madam! Her voice was very calm as if she had already made her peace. If he decides to leave, I won't stop him. 8 years is enough. She placed the last piece of clothing into the suitcase, then sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her left hand. The long scar along her arm gleamed conspicuously under the light. It was left there when she saved him. She had loved him for 8 years, had used a scarred arm to save him, and had traded a lie for a week's happiness. Now, everything was coming to an end. She picked up her phone and booked a flight for the next morning. Then she lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, not crying. She had cried enough. Downstairs, Sophia grabbed Ethan's arm, trying to pull him away. She said, Ethan, let's go. Now that you know the truth, you don't need to stay here anymore. Ethan didn't move. He looked at the diary left open on the coffee table, the last page bearing Vivian's handwriting. He woke up. He called me his wife. 8 years. This is the first time he's called me his wife. I know I took advantage of him, but this time I don't want to miss him again. She lied to him, but she waited for him for 8 years. She took advantage of his vulnerability, but her love is real. Ethan stood in the living room. Before him, Sophia's expectant eyes. Behind him, the sound of Vivian packing her bags. He made a decision. Chapter 6. Sophia grabbed Ethan's arm, tried to pull him out the door. Her voice urgent. Ethan, let's go. She lied to you. You don't owe her anything. We'll leave this place. I'll take you to where you used to live. Wait. Ethan stopped in his tracks. Sophia froze. What? Ethan looked at her. You just said the person I loved in the past was you. Sophia nodded. Yes. We were together for 3 years, you. Then why did we break up? Sophia's lips stiffened. This isn't important. What's important is that you were tricked, she. Not important? Ethan interrupted her, his voice calm, but something in his eyes was growing cold. We were together for 3 years, and then we broke up. You said the one I loved deeply was you, but you wouldn't tell me why we broke up. Sophia's expression shifted slightly. Ethan, now is not the time to talk about this. Why won't you answer? Sophia's lips trembled, but she said nothing. Ethan watched her silence, and something inside him stirred. She was hiding something. He didn't know what it was, but he could feel Sophia wasn't telling the whole truth. He said, I'll go upstairs first. Ethan. He let go of Sophia's hand and walked toward the staircase. Sophia stood where she was, watching him leave, her face ashen. Ethan reached the door of Vivian's room. The door was half open. He pushed it and saw Vivian kneeling on the floor, folding his clothes. Her movements were slow, her hands trembling slightly, tears silently dripping onto the shirts, but she didn't stop. She folded each piece of clothing neatly and placed them into the suitcase beside her. Ethan stood in the doorway, watching her. She heard footsteps, looked up, and saw it was him. She immediately wiped away her tears and forced a smile. The luggage is almost packed. You can leave whenever. Vivian. Ethan interrupted her. He stepped into the room and crouched down in front of her. Vivian looked at him. Her eyes held fear, hope, and a profound weariness. Ethan said, "You lied to me." Vivian lowered her lashes. "Yes. You said we've been married for 2 years. Yes. You took advantage of my amnesia and tricked me into signing a marriage certificate." Vivian's lips trembled. "Yes." Ethan said nothing. He looked at her ashen face, at her trembling hands, at the long scar along her arm. She had deceived him, but she had waited for him for 8 years. She had taken advantage of him in his weakest moment. Yet she bore a lifetime scar from saving him. The past is the past. Ethan spoke, his voice soft but firm. The present is the present. Vivian lifted her head and looked at him. Ethan said, "You are my wife. I don't care what happened before, but you are now." Vivian's body froze. She looked at him, her pupils widening, lips parted slightly, as if hearing something impossible. "You?" Ethan said, "I'm not leaving. I'm not going to be apart from you." Vivian's eyes went red in an instant. "You know I lied to you. I know. You know I took advantage of you. I know. You know I've had a crush on you for 8 years. I know." Ethan reached out and, for the first time, held her in his arms. Vivian went rigid, unable to breathe. Ethan said, "I know everything. I know you lied to marry me. I know you waited for me for 8 years. I know you stayed to save me and kept the scars." His arm tightened, pulling her into his embrace. "But I don't want to leave." Vivian's tears burst forth instantly. She clutched Ethan's collar with both hands, trembling as she cried. 8 years. This was the first time in her life she had received a response. She cried, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry I lied to you. I'm sorry I took advantage of you. I'm sorry." Ethan said, "Don't apologize. You waited 8 years. You don't need to apologize." Vivian buried her face in his chest, crying until she couldn't speak. She had waited 8 years. She thought there would never be a response in this life. But now, he held her and said he was her husband. Sophia stood in the doorway, her face ashen. She watched Ethan holding Vivian, watched Vivian trembling with sobs, watched Ethan's hand gently patting her back. Sophia's voice was sharp. "Ethan, are you crazy? She lied to you." Ethan turned his head and looked at her calmly. "Sophia, whatever happened in the past, my choice now is Vivian." Sophia's face went deathly pale. "You," Ethan said, "I don't know what our relationship was before, but I know she waited for me 8 years. She got hurt saving me, and every day she feared I would leave." He looked at Sophia, his gaze very calm. "I don't want her to wait any longer." Sophia clenched her teeth and turned to leave. Her footsteps faded at the end of the corridor, and the door shut heavily. Ethan turned back and looked at Vivian. She still clutched his collar, tears streaming down her face. Her voice trembled. "You really won't leave?" "No." "You really chose me?" "Yes." Vivian buried her face in his chest and cried even harder. Arthur stood at the end of the corridor, his eyes rimmed with red. He turned and walked toward the kitchen. Tonight, he would prepare a lavish dinner. That night, Vivian curled up in Ethan's arms and asked softly, "If one day you regain your memories, would you still choose me?" Ethan kissed her forehead. "I would." Vivian buried her face in his chest and said nothing. She couldn't bring herself to believe it, but she wanted to. Chapter 7. A few days later, Sophia came again. This time she brought a stack of photos and a few letters. Ethan saw her in the living room and frowned. "Why are you here again?" Sophia said, "I want to help you get your memories back. You're amnesic. You don't know what you've lost." She spread the photos out on the tea table. Ethan looked down, scenes of the university campus, the two of them walking hand in hand from behind, a photo of them in a cafe, the picture of him pinning a corsage on her at graduation. Sophia's voice carried a certain urgency. These are the 3 years we were together. Have you forgotten? You told me you loved me. You said you wanted to marry me. A sudden, sharp pain struck Ethan's temple. He clutched his head as his vision began to blur. Memories surged over him like a tide. He saw his past, walking with his head down in the high school corridor, studying in the university library, working as a product manager at a tech company after graduation. He saw scenes of himself with Sophia. They ate together in the cafeteria, strolled on the athletic field, embraced at the graduation ceremony. He saw his apartment, his job, his everyday life. Then he saw more. He saw a girl in the high school corridor who would always hide behind a pillar, secretly watching him. He saw someone standing at a distance during the sports meet offering him water. He took it and walked on without turning back. He saw that girl clapping in the corner at graduation, something indescribable in her eyes. He never looked back at her. The last thing he remembered was a scene before the accident. He came home from work, opened the apartment door, and saw Sophia kissing a man. That man was his colleague. Sophia's face went ashen. She tried to explain, but he simply turned and walked away. The next day, he drove out and got into a car accident. The memory breaks off here. Ethan opened his eyes to find himself sitting on the sofa, his palms drenched in sweat. Do you remember now? Sophia's voice sounded in his ear. Ethan looked up at her. I remember. Sophia's eyes brimmed with tears. Then do you remember? The 3 years we were together. Ethan said, I remember. I also remember why we broke up. Sophia's expression changed. Ethan's voice was very calm. You cheated. I was with you for 3 years, and then you cheated with my colleague. Sophia's lips trembled as she tried to explain. Ethan, that wasn't. Wasn't what? Sophia couldn't speak. Ethan stood up and looked at her. You told me Vivian tricked me into marrying her. You said she took advantage of my helplessness. She did. Ethan cut her off. She tricked me into marrying her. But she never lied to me about her love. He looked at Sophia, his gaze very cold. And you? You told me you were the one I loved deeply, but you didn't tell me you betrayed me. Sophia's face went ashen. Her voice sharpened. Even if I betrayed you, what about Vivian? Didn't she deceive you too? She had a crush on you for 8 years, and you never reciprocated. She took advantage of your amnesia. She waited for me for 8 years. Ethan interrupted her. She liked me since high school. She brought me water. She followed me to Beijing. She was left with a lifetime scar saving me. He looked at Sophia, and I never once looked back at her. Sophia gritted her teeth, unable to speak. Ethan said, go. No matter what happened in the past, my choice now is Vivian. Sophia stood for a few seconds, then turned and walked away. Ethan sat on the sofa, staring at the photos on the coffee table. He remembered the girl who always hid behind the crowd, recalled her hand trembling slightly when she handed him water, and remembered the line in her diary. 8 years. This is the first time he's called me wife. He had never looked back at her, but now he could. In the evening, Vivian returned home. She pushed the door open and saw Ethan sitting in the living room, his expression complex. Her heart suddenly raced. She asked, you what's wrong? Ethan looked up at her. I've regained my memories. Vivian's expression changed in an instant. She took a step back, clutching the strap of her bag. You remembered? Yes. Vivian's lips trembled and she couldn't speak. She was afraid. She was afraid that after he remembered, he would leave. Ethan stood up and walked toward her. Vivian instinctively took another step back. Ethan stopped, looking at her. Are you afraid? Vivian said nothing. She just looked at him, her eyes growing redder. Ethan reached out and took her hand. He pulled a ring from his pocket, the one he had gone out to buy that afternoon. He slipped the ring onto her ring finger. I didn't give this to you before. Consider this making up for it. Vivian looked at him, tears streaming down her face. Ethan said, Vivian, marry me. Vivian couldn't stop crying. She looked at him, at the ring on his hand, at the earnest look in his eyes. You've regained your memory, you still? Ethan said, I still choose you. I remember everything, including those days when I never looked back at you. He looked at her, his voice very soft. I'm sorry I kept you waiting for so long. Vivian's tears broke loose. She threw herself into his arms, trembling as she cried. I've waited so long, for so long. Ethan held her. I know. You don't have to wait anymore. Chapter 8. A month later, Ethan took Vivian back to the high school playground where they had spent their youth. It was evening. The setting sun bathed the whole field in gold. Classes were over, and on the empty track only the wind stirred fallen leaves. Vivian stood at the edge of the track, staring at the familiar scene, a little puzzled. Why did you bring me here? Ethan didn't answer. He walked to the center of the track, turned, and looked at her. Then he dropped to one knee. Vivian's body went rigid. Ethan spoke, his voice unusually clear in the wind. 8 years ago, you watched me here in secret. Vivian's eyes instantly filled with tears. Ethan said, I've never looked back. Not once. He looked at her, his gaze earnest. Today I kneel here to formally propose to you. He took the ring from his pocket. He had prepared it. This time, it was his initiative. Vivian, marry me. Vivian covered her mouth, tears streaming uncontrollably. She had waited 8 years. She had thought there would never be a response in this lifetime. But now he was kneeling before her, a ring in his hand, his gaze so earnest it was as if he were making the most important decision of his life. She nodded desperately, unable to speak. Ethan stood up and slipped the ring onto her ring finger. Then he held her, whispering in her ear, You don't have to steal glances anymore. I'm right here in front of you. Vivian buried her face in his chest, crying until her whole body trembled. 3 months later, the wedding. Vivian, wearing a white wedding dress, stood at the church door. Her hands were trembling. Arthur stood beside her, his eyes rimmed with red. He murmured, Madam, you've been waiting for this day for a long time. Vivian nodded and took a deep breath. The doors opened. She walked in, each step feeling like treading over 8 years of time. Guests on both sides were watching her, but she could only see the man standing ahead. Ethan, dressed in a black suit, stood before the priest and watched her walk toward him. His gaze was gentle, as if looking at the most precious thing in the world. Vivian reached him, tears already blurring her vision. Ethan reached out and took her hand. Vivian couldn't stop her tears. The priest began reciting the vows, but not a single word reached her. She simply watched him, watched his eyes, his lips, the slight upward curve at the corners of his mouth. Vivian, will you marry Ethan? The priest's voice sounded in her ear. Vivian opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Tears streamed down her face, and her throat felt as if something was lodged in it. In the end, she only said one sentence. I've waited for you for so long, so long. Ethan's eyes were red too. He reached out and wiped the tears from her face. He said, I know. You don't have to wait anymore. He slid the ring onto her finger, then bowed his head and kissed her. Applause and cheers rose from the crowd below. Vivian leaned against him, tears still flowing, but her face was already full of smiles. She waited for 8 years. Finally, the wait was over. After marriage, Vivian was still that possessive, delicate, sickly CEO. If Ethan came home 5 minutes late, she'd pout in grievance. Why are you only just back? Every morning when Ethan left for work, she'd send a message. I miss you. On weekends when she lingered in bed, she clung to his arm and refused to let go, insisting he say, Wife, I miss you, before she would get up. Ethan would always comply, helplessly indulgent. Arthur stood at the doorway, watching the two of them curled up on the sofa in the living room, tears welling in his eyes. He remembered what Vivian was like in high school, always hiding in a corner, watching that boy's back, some indescribable look in her eyes. She waited 8 years. Finally, it arrived. One night, the two of them were curled up on the sofa watching TV. Vivian suddenly turned her head and looked at Ethan. Do you regret it? Regret what? Back then in the hospital, you called me wife. Ethan looked at her and said seriously, No regrets. Why? Ethan said, Because if you hadn't said wife, we wouldn't have registered our marriage. He reached out and took her hand. If we hadn't registered our marriage, I would never have known you'd loved me for 8 years. His gaze was very gentle. If I hadn't known that you had liked me for 8 years, I wouldn't have fallen in love with you. Vivian's eyes brimmed with tears. She buried her face in his chest, her voice muffled. I wouldn't regret it either. That time I took advantage of your helplessness. Ethan smiled, leaned down, and kissed her forehead. Wife. I love you. Vivian's tears flowed down. But this time, they were tears of happiness. It began with an offhand wife and ended with a heartfelt, I love you. This 8-year-long secret love finally found its echo.